I'm Paige Keeley.
And I'm Joyce Tugel. I had the pleasure of working on the high school Inspire Science program, and I've been developing the science probes for the biology and chemistry and physics and earth science, and now working on the physical science program. So they all start with a probe.
And I was involved, I think it was about 5 years ago, working on the middle school program. I think McGraw-Hill recognized my work in formative assessment and invited me to be part of this project. And recently I've been developing probes for the elementary Inspire project as well. There are 3 phases to assessment: diagnostic assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. So I'm going to define those 3. So diagnostic assessment is the process of collecting information about where students are, where they are in their thinking, and trying to understand their ideas and where they come from. Now, diagnostic becomes formative when you use that information. If you don't use that information to make instructional decisions, then it's just diagnostic assessment. But it's formative when you use that data to make instructional decisions. Then summative is the type of assessment that occurs after students have had the opportunity to learn the science, and now they're ready to be evaluated on the extent to which they have met that standard or that learning goal. So those are the 3 phases and purposes of assessment. So I think together they sort of define what assessment is. To define what a science probe is, let's define that word probe and think about how it's used in other contexts. So for example, NASA sends probes into space to gather information that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to get through ordinary land instruments. Or a doctor might use a probe to look around inside the body for things that would not be obvious just looking from the outside. You may have used a probe at Thanksgiving time or Christmas when you're cooking that turkey, and it's hard to tell if the turkey is cooked just by looking at it, but there's that little white thing that pops up out of the turkey. That's a temperature probe that gives you information about whether your turkey is cooked or not, which you can't get just by looking at it. So that's what formative assessment probes are. They are instruments that we use to really get inside students' heads and find out what are they really thinking in there, not just what they think the answer is that the teacher wants to hear, but what are the ideas that they really have in their heads that we need to be aware of? And to do that, we have to use specially designed questions that reveal those ways of thinking. There are about 10 different formats that I use when I develop probes, and the 3 that I think I use most commonly would be the justified list probes, the friendly talk probes, and the PEO probes. A justified list probe is just like the name implies. It's a list of things that fit a particular concept or phenomenon, and students choose from that list which things fit that concept or phenomenon, and then they explain their reasoning or the rule that they use to decide if it fit that concept or phenomenon. So that's one of my signature formats. The other one would be the friendly talk probes. So instead of choosing A, B, C, or D, the answer choices are the names of people, and the answers are their ideas. So it's sort of conversational. They're talking about something in science, and each person has a different idea, and here is what they said. And then the student selects the person that they most agree with and explain why they agree with that person. The third format that I use a lot is called the PEO probe, and that stands for predict, explain, and then observe, or the O can also stand for obtain more information. So the prediction is the answer choice that you commit to. The E is your explanation for why you chose that answer. And then often this kind of probe launches right into actually making observations, the O part, to see if the outcome is what you actually predicted. Or it might be turning to text or other media to obtain more information to support your prediction. So there are about 7 other kinds of formats I use, but those are the 3 that I use most commonly in my work. science probe is specifically designed to reveal ways of thinking students have about phenomena or concepts. Now, typical questions are not designed to do that. Typical questions often involve recall, or they might be vocabulary based, but a probe is a little different because the answer choices that go along with the probes actually mirror research that has been done on students' commonly held ideas in science. So when you use a probe, you're often noticing how students' ideas actually mirror some of the research that's been done on common conceptions that students have. So in some ways I call them, even though I don't like to use that word misconception-oriented probes, because they're specifically designed to pull out what we know about commonly held ideas. Now that is if there has been done, research has been done around a particular concept or phenomenon. In some cases, research has not been done, but I think we have a pretty good understanding of how students think about some of these ideas, that we can almost predict what some of those answer choices will be. So they're different from other kinds of questions because you can almost predict how students will answer them based on their everyday experiences, their interactions with the natural world, and even sometimes just their sense of intuitiveness. So I guess that's what makes them different from typical kinds of questions that we ask. When I develop a probe, the first thing that I start with is a learning goal. And that might come from the framework for K-12 science education, the NGSS, or sometimes what a big overarching concept is that is usually embedded in most standards. But I identify that learning goal, and then I think about the format that I want to use, whether it's a justified list, a PEO, friendly talk, 7 other formats. And then I begin to develop the prompt, something that is engaging, that will draw students in. Often I will use a familiar phenomenon, something that they've experienced in their everyday interactions with their natural world. And then I do a literature search to see if there's been any research that's been done on how students think about that concept or phenomenon, and I build my answer choices from that. So there's always one best answer, which would be the scientific way of thinking about it, but the other answer choices would come from research that's been done about how children and adults typically think about these concepts and phenomena. And then, of course, there's always a second part, and that's why we call these 2-tiered probes, because after students commit to an answer choice, the second part that I develop is the explanation, asking students to explain their thinking and share their rule or the reasoning that they use to come up with their answer choice. So there's quite a bit of research behind these that has to be done first to think about the answer choices, and a lot of thinking about what is the best format or best phenomenon to use to engage students.
I think that's one of my favorite parts of using the probes. Teachers and students, we've become accustomed to the teacher being the expert and the sage on the stage. And students are used to, if they don't know an answer, they turn to the teacher and ask. Or if the teacher asks a question and the student answers it, the first thing they want to know is, am I right? And the probes help us change that culture and the atmosphere so that we're not looking for right or wrong answers. And the teacher's letting the students know that I really am interested in what you're thinking. And by starting in a non-threatening way with these probes that have a familiar phenomenon and it's something that the students are accustomed to, like an ice cube melting, and then having a conversation around, well, what do you think happens to the mass of that ice cube as it melts and becomes water? And using a 2-tiered approach where the students can predict, I think the mass is going to increase, or I think the mass is going to decrease, or no, I think the mass is going to stay the same. And then having them write down why it is they're thinking what they're thinking. This starts to create a whole culture of ideas are celebrated. It's not right or wrong. It's not the judgment piece that matters. And the teachers and students are working alongside each other and exploring some interesting phenomenon and trying to make sense of the world. And that's what science is all about.
we have two banned words when teachers use the probes. We ban the word right answer and the word wrong answer. It should always be about your best answer or your best thinking so far. When we use words like the right answer or the correct answer, those are judgmental words. And if you are a student who doesn't get what we call the right answer or the correct answer, that sends a message that I'm not good at science. But they are good at science. They come to their learning with some ideas that may not be scientifically correct, but they have ideas in their heads that make sense to them. So that's why we like to use the terminology of the best answer so far, because it mirrors the nature of science or the history of science, that as we get more information, more evidence, we learn more, our thinking changes. But we always have to start somewhere with some kind of idea that's in our heads. A great historical example would be that historically, for a long time, people thought that the sun revolved around the earth. And until we came up with models to explain that, that was a strongly held belief because that's what people saw. In the morning, they'd see the sun rise in the east and they would see it set in the west. So of course that made sense to them that it was the sun that was moving, not the earth. And so it's the same thing with students. You know, they start with what they have in their heads, their ways of making sense about the natural world. And instead of telling them they're wrong, which would shut them down, we recognize that their ideas are starting points for learning. And the most important thing is for us to get those ideas out and then gather more information so we can revisit them again. And then in that process, we sometimes find that our ideas change.
That's a great point, Paige. And you'll notice in the teacher notes that we provide with each of the probes, we always say the best response is. We never say the right answer is. I think a key piece there that you're mentioning is the idea of integration, that we don't think of curriculum, instruction, and assessment as three separate entities. They interweave together, and we have to make sure we're thinking about which of those components is best going to meet the needs of our students. Many people use a 5E approach to developing an instructional sequence. And they start with an engagement, something that's going to hook the kids or something that's going to elicit their current thinking. Probes are a great way to get into that engagement. And then during the exploration piece of learning, students can be predicting, students can be testing their ideas, and probes can fit in as a way to test out some of those ideas. During the explanation phase, we're getting into the formal concept development, and probes can help students articulate their thinking and their ideas as they're talking about the science ideas they're learning. As we go into elaboration, we want to find ways to extend that thinking so that students are looking at the learning in a new, novel context. What better way to think of a novel context than by seeing if there's a probe that might give a different example of a similar concept? And then finally, during evaluation isn't simply a summative test, but it's an opportunity for reflection, and it's an opportunity to revisit earlier thinking and think about how you might revise some of your ideas based upon what you've learned in that other phase of the learning cycle.
So I think what's important that you described is something we call continuous assessment. And assessment starts at the beginning before we've even taught to elicit and find out what students' initial ideas are, and then checking along the way to see how those ideas are changing or being modified. And even at the end, to reflect back and understand how your thinking has changed and what was it that led to that change in thinking. So a question that we get a lot is, when do you use these probes? So clearly you can see that during the 5E instructional model, you can use a probe in any of those stages. But I think the really important thing to keep in mind, whether you're using a single probe or a collection of probes, is they need to be used more than once. And you need to make sure you do not give students the answer after you initially use a probe, because the power of using these probes is when students get to revisit them a second time after they've gone through this model and had the opportunity to learn the science, so that now they can use the science that they learned to revisit this probe and either change or expand upon their answer choice and explanation. So I just can't say enough that they need to be used more than once, and sometimes even 3 times.
And to add to that, another important component of this is, if we're talking continuous assessment, is that we as the teacher are not going to be putting X's or red marks or grades on those assessments. We are so accustomed to putting grades on things, and that immediately becomes a judgment call, and quite often will shut a student down because they figure, well, the teacher gave me that grade, and so that's the end of it. In continuous assessment, we're putting the power on the students. We're empowering them to look at, what do I know and how do I know it, and what else do I need to know to fully get to this idea? And so no red pens allowed on formative assessments. I wouldn't say there's an appropriate time to use a probe. However, there needs to be important reasons for using a probe.
I cannot say enough that you need to read the teacher notes before you use a probe. And there are 2 primary reasons for this. First of all, the teacher notes will give you the best scientific explanation for the answer choice. And that's important because everyone has misconceptions, even teachers at any grade level. And you might not even be aware that you may be holding on to one of those misconceptions. And so first of all, you've got to be clear about the science. You have to be clear that you understand the science and that any of your hidden misconceptions, which might be there, do not come through. Second, the teacher notes also kind of give you a sense of how students think about this concept or the phenomenon, so that you can almost anticipate in advance how your students might respond to this. So it's really helpful to be aware of that first before you use a probe, what some of those commonly held ideas are that students are likely to have. So always read the teacher notes first before you use the probe.
Probes aren't graded because we're looking to find ways to uncover student thinking. And we're doing that for 2 reasons. The first is so that it can inform our instruction. What do we need to do next in our instructional sequence? But we're also doing that so that students are thinking about their ideas, and they're thinking about their ways of thinking, the ways they're making sense of the world. And as we work through with probes, they're becoming very invested in their ideas. And if we start putting red lines or numbers or grades on their probes, we're turning that into more of a judgmental call. And we want those probes to be what's called assessment for learning, not assessment of learning. In assessment for learning, both the teacher and the student are going to benefit from examining the questions and thinking about their ideas. In assessment of learning, we're looking for more of an evaluative final number to put on that, and the thinking is stopped.
So as Joyce described, the preposition makes a difference. Assessment for learning is different from assessment of learning. The other way to think about it is that instead of grading probes, we should be giving students feedback on their ideas. And feedback is an essential feature of formative assessment. And there have really been some very interesting studies that have been done comparing grading students' papers versus just giving them feedback. And when students have the opportunity to revisit a task, often when they revisit the task, their performance improves when they're given feedback versus being given grades. So being given grades can sometimes have a negative effect. So if you get a low grade, then that student might think, well, I'm just not good at this, and give up. But at the same time, the student gets a high grade, might say, oh, I'm good enough. I don't have to think about this anymore. So grading can have a negative effect on assessment for learning. So that's why our suggestion is use them for feedback, not for grades.
That research is important, Paige. It's not fair to grade students on what they're still learning. I've been working with a number of districts in recent years who are trying to shift from their old standards to these new standards. Quite often it is the next generation science standards, or it's some adaptation of that. And a key piece to this, a concern I have, is that a lot of districts are starting to use the next gen science standards as the new list of topics we teach. And the next gen is much more than topics we teach. It's important to go all the way back to the foundation upon which the next gen science standards were built, and that is the framework for K-12 science education. And if you look at the vision of that framework and the message that it's communicating, that this is meant for all students and it's meant to prepare and inspire and motivate our students and be ready for their futures, whatever those futures may be, you need to think about, why are we doing this new approach where we're interweaving these science practices and these core ideas and these cross-cutting concepts and coming up with these new performance expectations? And the reason is we're trying to shift folks to think about not what we're teaching, but what and how students are learning. And by bringing in this three-dimensional approach of weaving science practices, how we're learning the topics is by doing the science, and how we're remembering and making those big ideas count is by weaving together the cross-cutting concepts. The message I have to folks is, don't throw out everything you've been doing. You don't have to start fresh, but you do have to ask yourself, is my program about what I'm teaching, or is it focusing on what and how the students are learning?
And I think the probes are really terrific resources to mirror the shifts in instructional practice with the NGSS. So for example, one of those big shifts is taking a three-dimensional approach. So instead of teaching content separate from practice, instead of not thinking about these big unifying themes, cross-cutting concepts, now we try to weave these three together, and the probes actually do that. So if you think about any of the formative assessment probes, they all target a disciplinary core idea, but then you have to use a practice as the second part of that probe. So every probe is two-dimensional in the aspect that they all involve constructing explanations, because students are asked to explain their thinking. They could be used in a talk format to support argumentation. They could launch into designing investigations. You might draw a picture to support your explanation, would be an example of developing and using a model. So each of the probes lends itself to incorporating the practices along with the disciplinary content. And then the third piece, the cross-cutting concepts, is that teachers can intentionally ask students to include one of those cross-cutting concepts in their explanation, whether they choose cause and effect, or patterns, or scale, or quantity, proportion, that they have the opportunity to use that cross-cutting concept to explain their thinking. So it's a nice way to kind of ease teachers into thinking about what three-dimensional teaching and learning looks like.